What I'm going to talk a little bit about today is I do this in a class that's called Envr 352, Energy, Society, and Sustainability. So I'm a joint appointment between the Department of Geography and the School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment. And the goal of the class is to think about how energy systems are more than just technical systems, right? But that they're impacted by things that people do, things that people want, things that people care about. And so that comes in the form of our policy, in terms of our economic systems, in terms of our culture. So what I'll talk about today is a little bit about some of the things that I do in the class. But what I'm trying to do in this is to get students to understand and apply the concepts of electricity generation and electricity generation capacity. And we'll sort of talk through a little bit about what those are. And then what I also ask them to do a lot is to create informed hypotheses of how our electricity system is changing and why. And we do that by basically starting with the data and then sort of based on whatever else they know is going on in the world. And this is sort of a couple weeks into the class sort of exercise. I'll ask them to interpret this data and come up with some theories of change of what's actually happening with the system. So I'll kind of walk through both of these. When we look at this, right, this is some data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and they collect this data about all the electricity generators that are out there in the U.S. And we have a nice historical kind of spread here of data that shows our generation capacity by source. And you can see our sort of 5 primary fuels that we use. They sort of group renewables together, but you can see nuclear, natural gas, petroleum, and coal. And we can see some changes, right? And how much coal is being used. We see some, stability around nuclear. We see an increase here in natural gas. So this is our electricity generation capacity, right? Remember, that's how big, if all the plants are running full blast at the same time, this shows us the breakdown between those different plants, right? So this is the actual generation, right? So here we can see coal, right, on the left, and natural gas, nuclear. And so what I'd like you all to do, I've clipped these so that we can compare, right? So on the left here, we have the generation capacity, right? And on the right, we have the actual generation. And so what I'd like you all to do, who have joined us today, is to sort of try and compare these, and how can we explain some of the differences that we see here between what's on the left, between the generation capacity and then what the actual generation on the right. So how can we explain what's happening here?
It looks like, so on the capacity compared to the generation, the capacity is how much power could be made versus the generation is how much power was made, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
So that would mean, like for nuclear, for example, that we've lost capacity, which probably means that like maybe some nuclear power plants have been decommissioned.
That's right.
Whereas the amount of generated has hardly changed, even though there's been some plants decommissioned, for example.
Yeah. So what would that tell you about, if we look at that relationship between generation capacity and actual generation, what would that tell you about how nuclear power plants are operated?
That they're operated at they're operated very consistently. Their energy capacity versus actual generation is very similar. They have a high efficiency.
Yeah.
And they're also maxed out, right? Aren't they?
Yes, they would be maxed out, right? So these are, the nuclear plants, we want to run these, or the way that they operate is that they run almost all the time. They'll have a capacity factor of usually above 90%, right? So they're going to be running as hard as they can all the time. And part of that's the nature of nuclear fuel. Once we get these things sort of lit, that's not the exact term, but it's really hard to stop that sort of chain reaction that's happening in the reactor. And so to turn a nuclear power plant off is really, really hard. It takes a lot of advanced planning. And so this is how we have incidents like what we saw with Fukushima a few years back, where we just couldn't stop that reaction. So nuclear is a really good example. Now take a look maybe at petroleum. What do we see about the relationship between petroleum generation capacity and generation?
It's not maximized there. It's generating a lot less than what it can produce or generate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is sort of the nature of how we use our petroleum generators. So these are oftentimes what we call peaker plants, meaning that on that super hot summer day, right, when everyone has their air conditioning cranking and our grid is sort of stressed to the maximum, we'll have these sort of reserve petroleum plants, which are basically like diesel engines, that diesel generators, like you may even have, at your house as a backup source of power. So a pretty big diesel generator that's only going to run maybe for 30 minutes, maybe for an hour a day at the maximum. And they're really costly to run because you're basically burning, diesel fuel. So they're costly to run. So we don't want to run them all the time, but they're easy to turn off and on. Just like starting up a lawnmower or starting up your car, it's pretty much instantaneous power. So these only run for really short periods of the day. So they're sort of dwindling in terms of how they're being used, and they take up, and they're sort of a very small percentage of our generators, but they actually perform a really important function in terms of sort of balancing our grid in these periods of really intense need. So that's sort of the relationship that I was hoping you all could kind of tease out there between generation capacity and generation. And what I want to look at now for the next little bit is some stuff about renewable energy. So this comes from the same U.S. Energy Information Administration date book, right? And we can see the growth of some of our different renewable sources here, or sorry, the change in some of our renewable sources here. So what are the big stories that we see here if we look at hydro, solar, wind?
Solar has grown exponentially. Wind also.
Yeah, so those are our two primary growth areas. If you look at hydropower, it's pretty stable. It's actually gone down a little bit, in part because we've removed some dams. If you look at geothermal, it's pretty stable. Geothermal is not where a lot of the growth is going. And despite, I think, initially a lot of thought that biomass was going to be a big part of our energy system, renewable energy systems, it's been pretty stable as well. So if we talk about solar just a little bit more, one of the sort of metrics that we can use to think about solar and where a good place to have solar energy is what's called average insolation. And so average insolation is basically just a fancy word for saying how much sunshine is hitting the ground in a given place, right? And from that, we can calculate how much electricity can actually be generated, right? So we measure average insolation in terms of kilowatt hours per square meter per day. And we can map that, right? So here's the sort of geographer in me. If we look at a map of the average insolation, it matches up pretty well with what we might expect, right? And the sort of desert Southwest, where you don't have a lot of rain, you don't have a lot of clouds to get in the way of the sun, you're going to have really high rates of insolation, of sun hitting the ground. So you can see sort of how our solar resource is distributed, right? We can think about that as being distributed just like oil or coal or something like that. So it's distributed here across the US. So based off of that, right, which areas do you think we would see the highest installed solar capacity? So I'll put that back. So where, if we were just thinking about it in terms of its sort of the photovoltaic resource, the solar resource, where should we have the most solar in the US?
It looks like it should be in the desert Southwest.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, right? We think that would be the area where we would have sort of the best resource. If we look at this, though, this shows the actual installed capacity for solar. Here, this one here. Some of it makes sense. California, right in first place. Arizona in third place. Second place, North Carolina. Fourth place, the Sunshine State, Massachusetts. I guess the Sunshine State's actually Florida. And number 5 is New Jersey. So how can we explain that, right? We have this, we have some places where it really makes sense. North Carolina, if we go back to our map, is not so different than South Carolina or Georgia. It has a smaller population than Florida, right? And Florida actually has a better solar resource. And Massachusetts has a pretty bad solar resource compared to most of these other places, yet it finishes way ahead a lot of them. So how can we explain that sort of variability? So what can be some of our hypotheses that explain that?
Well, I can think of several that couldn't explain that. Like one that came to mind was like land area. Massachusetts, it's a really small state, so it doesn't have a whole lot of area to put a whole bunch of solar panels.
Yeah.
And clearly from the map, it doesn't have to do with really great solar potential, because it doesn't have that either.
Yeah, so what could be driving it?
Tax incentives.
Yeah, so that's a big one.
Mm-hmm. Just general interest from the public, from the populations living in those states.
Potentially, I think that's a good thought, and maybe we can think about what that translates into, right? General interest. What would general interest potentially translate into that could help, shape the sort of power plants that are being built? I think we've already said one of them, tax incentives.
I mean, not just, not just taxes, but general policies that the different state governments might put forward, encouraging use of different resources.
Yeah, that's right. So state incentives. One of the big ones that we'd have is what's called a renewable portfolio standard. And these are in about half the states in the US. And basically a renewable portfolio standard says by X year, by 2030, you need to have 20% of our electricity coming from renewable energy. So portfolio standards are a big one. Tax incentives are a big one. And then there's one other thing that maybe is a driver. And Nina, I think it's related sort of to what you said, people that have an interest in it. Think about during the Super Bowl this past year. If anybody watched the Super Bowl this past year, what does anybody remember the Chipotle advertisement?
Didn't it have something to do with organic?
I don't remember it. I'll have to
So
look it
there's
up.
a bunch of hippies that want solar power in Massachusetts.
Not just hippies. Think about Apple, Google. What have they sort of pledged that they're going to do around their energy system?
Make it more green.
Yeah, they all say that they want to be 100% renewable, right? And that they're on track to do so. So some of the things that we see is that there's actually big corporate buyers of renewable energy in these states, so that they can actually, if you're going to build a solar farm and you have somebody that says we're going to buy all that power, you've got a pretty good deal going. So you're going to be able to get money from the bank to build it. So we've seen a lot of these corporate deals in places like New Jersey and places like Massachusetts, and in fact, places like North Carolina, where there's a lot of sort of the tech companies that have locations there. So some of the different things that you all have said, right? We can talk about these state level renewable portfolio standards. So North Carolina actually had a very, not particularly ambitious, but a very early renewable portfolio standard. It was one of the first in the country that said that they wanted to have 12.5% renewable energy by 2021, which they've met primarily through solar. The second one is tax credits, right, which was one of the first things that you all said. So North Carolina, for example, again, offered a very generous tax credit of 25% on top. And so that's 25% of the cost of the solar installation. The third one is sort of esoteric. This is federal policy which allowed basically a set of rules about how, and it was sort of states could interpret how they wanted to apply the federal rules. And so I won't get into that, but that has made a big impact in some states. And then there's things that like net metering, right? Net metering is basically a policy that allows you to, if you're a residential household, to sell your power back out onto the grid. You know, it's like running your car in reverse and making the odometer go back. There's also what's called a feed-in tariff, where you can get additional money for selling power back onto the grid. So not only do they let you run your meter backwards, but you turn into a little power plant that can make some money. And then the other driver is just the way that our cost of solar has just fallen so dramatically, which you can see here. This shows from 2010 to 2018, the cost of putting solar, for example, on your residential roof has gone from about $7.30 per watt down to $2.70. And it's even lower for our big installations, big solar farms that we see out there. And the biggest driver of this has been the decreasing cost of the modules themselves, the solar panel. And then just to wrap up, I just wanted to show kind of the changing landscapes of state incentives. So what this is a US map that shows where different solar plants are sort of operating in the US. And you can see these really quite clear clusters here in California, for example, and sort of this part of Arizona. A lot of that actually feeds California. So this is a couple of years ago. And one of the things you see is that over the course of the last 2 years, there's really just been an explosion of solar. I mean, look at Florida, look at South Carolina, even now. We see Illinois, Texas has become a real hot spot for solar development, lots more in New York. So there's just been a real substantial increase in the amount of solar. And it's really dramatic if we just look at South Carolina. I always like to look at this very strict line here between North Carolina and South Carolina that existed. But that's starting to change, right? You see a lot of these that are under development here, a lot of the solar facilities that are under development that are starting to move into South Carolina. So, you know, there's some real positive kind of change that's happening here. A summary slide to begin with, but what I like to do sort of in this, and what I hope you kind of saw, is how we can use data to try to generate some informed hypotheses about electricity system change. And I think that resource, the Energy Information Administration Data Book, is really a really useful one. And then, you know, more recently, there's been all kinds of interesting stuff happening with our electricity grid if you follow the news in Texas. So being able to have our students, I mean, my goal is to have the students be able to have sort of informed conversations about some of these things and the sort of changing shape of renewables. And so I'm happy to kind of talk about any of these things that are of interest to you all.
I want to thank you for having joined us at the Gamecock Teaching Days.
Yes, thanks everybody, and yeah, thanks for having me.